Welcome to Carnegie Politica podcast. My name is Alex Gabuev. I'm director of Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center in Berlin. Today we're going to talk about Syria and Russia's role in the dramatic events that are unfolding. When we planned to record this episode a week ago, the situation looked very differently. The rebels have taken Aleppo and northern parts of the country. They are inching closer on a couple of key cities in the middle of the country like Homs and Hama, but it was not yet clear that Damascus and regime of Bashar al-Assad will fall in just a couple of days, undoing nearly a decade of Vladimir Putin's effort to create a showcase for Russia's power to keep its authoritarian allies in place, and thus injecting Russia in the Middle East and expanding Russia's influence globally. To unpack this very complex dynamic, I'm very happy to be joined by two extremely prolific and extremely thoughtful colleagues who are a dream team. Nicole Grajewski is a fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who works on, among other things, nuclear issues, but also Russia's relationship with Iran. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm happy to have back Hanna Notte, who is director of the Eurasia Nonproliferation Program at James Martin Center at Middlebury Institute for International Studies at Monterey. Welcome back, Hanna.
Thanks for having me, Sasha. I'm very happy to join Nicole, whose work I greatly admire and who's also a friend.
All right, friends. Did you, Hanna, expect that when we were talking about this, Assad will be out and there will be no more horrible regime in Syria?
I did not expect this outcome, and I think I was in good company. I think few observers in Syria saw this event coming, a rebel offensive that would unfold at such scale and speed that it would result in less than 10 days in the actual fall of the Assad regime. So yes, I was stunned. I was actually in the Middle East when it happened. I was in Manama, Bahrain over the weekend. And I can just tell you that everyone there, and there were people from different countries in the region, everyone was amazed and stunned by what was unfolding.
Nicole, how was your crystal ball?
I mean, I could lie and say that I predicted it, but I definitely didn't. I agree with Hanna. I mean, Hanna's work is phenomenal. And we've kind of been looking at this together actually for so many years. And just to see this happen and unfold so rapidly, kind of unraveling this decades long effort on Iran's behalf and also Russia's behalf to keep Assad afloat, just kind of overnight. And it was really remarkable. I don't think really anyone really expected it.
Okay, I think that there are multiple layers to the crisis, and we won't go in all of them because I would love us to focus on Russia's role and impacts of these events on Russia's global standing, Russia's role in the region, and also maybe we will have time to talk about the impact on war in Ukraine. Hanna, support for Assad regime was obviously crucial endeavor for Russia. Why is that? And in what way? Can you walk me through various layers of why the Kremlin in the first place decided to intervene in the civil war back in 2015 and why it kept investing in this Syria endeavor despite multiple other priorities?
Let's take us back to the situation in September 2015 when Russia decided to intervene. The Assad government was barely controlling 20% of Syria at the time. I mean, some estimates even put it to under 10% of the territory. So it was losing territory fast to the rebels. And I think we need to remember that Russia was looking with apprehension at the Arab Spring in general and at changes unfolding in the region. And it definitely wanted to draw a red line under what it perceived to be Western fermented regime change in the region in Syria. Putin was very vexed by the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya in 2011, after the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1973 at the time, which, eventually led to the fall of Gaddafi in late 2011. Putin was prime minister at the time. the abstention by Russia on the Security Council had come from then President Medvedev. We know that Putin, he talked, I think, of a medieval crusades against Gaddafi, and Assad was not to suffer the same fate as Gaddafi, especially considering the Russian presence in Syria, the historical ties with the Assad family. So this is kind of key to understanding why the Russians decided to intervene at the time. What is sometimes forgotten, I think, is that there was also a desire in the fall of 2015 to bring Russia into a situation where, by creating new facts on the ground in Syria, it would sort of force the United States to cooperate with Russia on equal terms. I think Russia envisioned some sort of division of labor in the fight against terrorism, the fight against the Islamic State in Syria. So there was a hope, I think, for that at the time. That obviously did not play out as Russia desired. Now, let's quickly talk about the support to Assad that then unfolded and why it was important. Of course, the military campaign was crucial. The initial air campaign by Russia, which was supported by the Russian Navy in an operation that was called the Syrian Express at the time. That operation very much stalled rebel momentum. It boosted the morale of the Syrian armed forces. Nicole could talk at great length about the collaboration between Russia and Iran at the time. But basically, by spring 2016, I think this support is really having an impact on the ground. And then you get to the late 2016 and the fall of Aleppo, which then paved the way for what we call the Astana process. So Russia, Iran, and Turkey working together. They create these de-escalation zones in 2017 in some parts of Syria. That then freed up resources for the regime to focus on the east. Later, these de-escalation zones were taken back by the regime, again with Russian backing, with the exception of Idlib province, which was sort of sealed off as a problem to be dealt with at a later stage. And this is where HTS was present. So this is, in a nutshell, the military side. The political backing was just as important. We have an evolution of a political process that was meant to settle the conflict through various rounds of Geneva conferences. Then the Russians hosted a Sochi Congress in early 2018. That Congress essentially diluted the question of a political transition to the question of constitutional reform. Russia also backed the Assad regime on the UN Security Council and at the OPCW when it came to the chemical weapons dossier. So there was a lot going on in terms of political backing. And the key here, I think, is to understand that Russia always stood with the Assad government. It never truly used its leverage to get the Assad regime to make any kind of meaningful concessions in this whole process. Why did Russia keep investing in Syria? This is my last point. I think we need to understand that it wasn't that pricey of an investment by Russia. The military operation that Russia conducted between 2015 and 2020 was actually quite easily affordable for Russia. And it was a good deal in terms of the cost benefit, because Russia also got to test all sorts of new weapons in this military operation. It rotated lots of forces through the Syrian theater. So that was like real combat training for Russian soldiers. And by doing this, Russia got a number of ancillary benefits. It underscored its image as a loyal ally that doesn't abandon Assad but stands with Assad, which I think is an image that resonated really globally among different constituencies. It underscored power projection, not just into Africa, which I think is something we'll talk about, but also vis-a-vis other regional players, Israel, Turkey, and Russia even was able to use this presence in Syria for some coercive signaling vis-a-vis NATO and the United States. Last year, for example, Russia again stepped up its harassment of US forces in northeast Syria because it has a presence there that could be leveraged to signal sort of displeasure with the Americans over other problems. And so there were lots of benefits that Russia got from this support.
Nicole, Astana process was mentioned. As far as I understand, the Local Balancing Act over the last couple of years has all the time involved very complicated and sophisticated coordination of interests between Russia and Iran, but also Turkey. And it looks like it was Erdogan's and Turkey's support and then probably a blessing to start this lightning offensive that brought HTS at de facto control over Syria. Although I know that parts of the country are contested and controlled by other groups. So it looks like the process of coordination between the street power has failed, or has it not? What's the crux of the complications that never led Moscow and Tehran to see what's coming?
The Astana process is actually pretty fascinating. So continued to be the Astana process after Kazakhstan changed the name of its capital to Nur-Sultan. And it continued to be the Astana process after it got changed. The name did get changed back to the capital eventually, but after Kazakhstan said that they would no longer host the Astana process. So since, I think, 2023, they've hosted these talks in different capitals. I mean, I think the latest iteration of this was in Doha, then as the regime fell, essentially. But the purpose of the Astana process, I think, for the Russians was it not only gave it a forum to kind of reshape Syria and kind of divide it into spheres of influence, as Hanna noted, to join diplomacy with kind of military moves on the ground. I mean, I think the de-escalation zones were really crucial to a lot of the Assad regime's efforts to eventually taking de-escalation zones in southern Syria and also towards the east as well when they did that offensive. And so it was a way to kind of solidify Assad's presence, the continuation of his rule, but also to manage relations between Iran, Russia, and Turkey. I mean, Iran and Russia didn't always see eye to eye. I mean, they had different definitions of what were terrorist groups in Syria. Iran took a very expansive view of this, whereas Russia was actually more willing to, have discussions with what they saw as like the moderate opposition. But then when it came to Turkey, I think that was the crucial node for the Russians. I mean, the Turkey-Russia relationship was probably like the only real continuation of the Astana process that we saw on the ground prior to this HTS offensive. Russia and Turkey would have like kind of follow on bilateral diplomacy where they would launch, joint patrols in certain provinces in Syria in the northwest. They pretty much tried to at least reconcile their competing interests at times where Russia was actually trying to facilitate Assad's normalization with Turkey prior to this offensive. So it was basically a way for a country, both Russia, Iran, and also Turkey, to divide Syria into what they saw as kind of like their spheres of influence or their spheres of activity. The fundamental question is, will the Astana process continue? Because Iran doesn't seem relevant anymore in this equation. Russia has limited interests, and Turkey is now kind of emerging as this kingmaker in Syria. I think that the utility of the Astana process was never really about settling Syria in a peaceful manner or in actually a just manner. It was really about the interests of the three powers who kind of were the guarantors of the process. So I think going forward, it wouldn't surprise me if there was a diminished role of the Astana process, or if maybe the last Astana process meeting did occur in Doha. I don't know. I can't say for certain yet. But that's just kind of my assessment of it. I mean, it was not a really functional forum to begin with. And so I think it's going to be a sustainable Syrian peace agreement or a sustainable Syrian vision for post-war reconstruction or post-war constitutional reform. I mean, it's not going to be in the Astana process. It'll likely be in a different forum.
What about the assessment? I've heard that from former deputy commander of Quds, who said that we saw some of the movements in Idlib and probably some preparations. We asked the Turks directly of what that means. And Hakan Fidan, the current foreign minister and former head of Turkish intelligence, said nothing to worry for you. So does it mean that the process was not working well, that one side, for example, used deception to kind of achieve its goals, or what does that mean?
Turkey was very frustrated with Assad's continued bombardment of Idlib. And so the initial HTS offensive was actually a pushback on the Assad regime. And I don't think that Turkey actually foresaw the Aleppo offensive and the collapse of the Assad regime's control over that so quickly. I mean, there was really interesting statements prior to this by Russia about potential Ukrainian involvement in supporting HTS and their improvement of their capabilities in the UN Security Council. And I believe that there was a report yesterday that actually said there was a few Ukrainian intelligence officers embedded with HTS. But I think that there was a clear recognition that at least even prior to the Assad's fall, that the HTS was the most powerful force in Idlib. HTS made it much more complicated when it came to Syrian and Turkey normalization. But I don't think Iran or Russia saw this coming. I mean, if they did, if there was any intelligence that they saw this offensive devolving in the way that it did, one would imagine that they would have provided more ground support and also more reinforcements. And that just didn't transpire. I mean, there's obviously the argument about capabilities, but had Iran seen this, Iran had enough active forces and troops to actually deploy to Syria, and they didn't do that. So I'm more on the side of it that they didn't really know what was going to unfold. And unless if the Quds Force has a crystal ball, but I don't think they do.
Obviously, the capabilities that Russia and Iran could put in place have been diminished and significantly weakened. Russia has been bogged down in Ukraine. It has to reallocate some of the personnel and equipment to the needs of Ukrainian campaign. And definitely, Wagner played an important role and has been diminished since killing of Prigozhin last year and transformation of the Russian PMCs. And also, obviously, Hezbollah and all of the proxy network of Iran have been significantly decapitated and diminished by Israeli strikes. So now that's water under the bridge. We are in an entirely new reality where Russia more is in a damage control mode. So Hanna, help me understand how you see the hierarchy of Russian priorities right now. Like, what is first order business? What can come secondary? And then secondly, it's also very important whether Russia has channels to talk to all of the players that are now in charge in Syria, including HTS.
Yeah, I think Russian priorities are fairly straightforward, Sasha. I think the highest priority at this time is for Russia to figure out a way to retain its main bases, Khmeimim and Tartus on the Mediterranean coast. Russian officials have made very clear that that is what they're working on at the moment. Maria Zakharova, in her weekly brief, said as much. It's about the protection of Russian citizens and assets in Syria. And I think as of today, Bloomberg's reporting that the Russians might be close to a deal on this, though I haven't seen anything further dependable to prove that. But that is the priority. And then the second priority is, I think, more generally to retain some political influence in order to shape this post-Assad Syria. And now, in terms of leverage that Russia has to do this and what they can offer, I think, first of all, they've been quite savvy in pivoting quite fast in how they talk about HTS and actors on the ground. I think when Sergei Lavrov was in Doha this past weekend, December 7th, the day before the Assad regime fell, and he said on stage at the Doha Forum, he was still talking about HTS as terrorists. He used that term on several occasions. And since the fall of the regime, you've seen this very rapid pivot by the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Kremlin to talk about opposition groups or armed opposition groups, and this notion that Russia will now engage with all actors inside Syria that have leverage over the political process. And I think, this kind of nimbleness or flexibility is, of course, not unprecedented for Russia. We've actually seen it in Syria before. Nicole and I have already talked about the Astana process. So in the Astana process, Russia had a certain flexibility when it came to some of the armed opposition groups, like a group like Jaish al-Islam, for instance, or Faylaq al-Rahman. Those were groups that Russia occasionally referred to as terrorists, but when it was politically expedient, Russia used a different kind of language about them. And maybe a more prominent example of that kind of flexibility is the way that Russia is now dealing with the Taliban in Afghanistan. So we see that kind of pragmatism signaled from Russia vis-a-vis HTS. Something that might also come in handy for Russia is the fact that through this multivariate military and political engagement that I outlined in answer to your previous question, Russia has actually cultivated ties with a great variety of actors in Syria, much beyond the Assad regime. But it engaged with different kinds of opposition groups, both inside and outside the country, with the armed groups through the Astana process. So it has those kinds of relationships. Now, with HTS, those relations might be more limited. It's something that I can't talk to with a great deal of expertise. But with different actors who might also shape the Syrian landscape. Russia has some ties. It might also be beneficial to Russia that it was never seen quite in the same light as the Iranians on the ground. I was working in Syrian track 2 diplomacy for 3 years, from 2017 to 2020, engaging with a lot of Syrians in these informal consultations and dialogues that we would convene. And an argument that you heard time and again is that Russia is hated in Syria because it's standing with the Assad regime, but it is better than Iran because it is not seen as a sectarian actor in Syria. It's just seen as a cynical opportunist actor that is pursuing its own interests, but not as intent on changing the demographics in Syria. And so I don't know to what extent this could benefit Russia now. It's just something I want to put out there as a thought. And then another thing that might benefit Russia in trying to retain some leverage is that it is, of course, a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So it is an important actor when it comes to potential legitimization internationally of a new government in Syria. So that's something that HTS and other actors have to keep in mind. And then let me just make a final point, again, just a thought, which is that when it comes to Russia's desire to retain its military presence and its bases in Syria, there are a number of other regional actors who might also wish to see this. The Arab states, whether we talk about Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Egypt, I think they're very concerned now with this strengthened Turkish role in the region, which now in Syria is even further magnified from what it was before. I think there's a lot of apprehension about this. And so these countries, to the extent that they have some leverage over the unfolding situation, might also support Russia keeping some presence and some influence in Syria as a counterweight to Turkey.
We'll come to that in a second, but let's try to think if Russians are chased out of Tartus and Hmeimim. Can they go elsewhere in the Mediterranean? Is there anything out there in Libya with Haftar or Algeria? What do you think, Nicole?
Russia has ties to Algeria. They're obviously playing a longer game in Libya. However, it does take quite a bit of effort to establish this. Hmeimim was actually established pretty quickly, to be honest. But like Tartus, for example, that's different. That's a naval refueling facility. The location in Syria is really important because it's a place where Russia can reload and kind of have reinforcements for its operations elsewhere. So just like the strategic location of Syria is one part of this. And then on top of it is, I think Russia at the moment isn't really thinking about that. I haven't seen any indications that Russia at the moment is trying to go and expand and have a bigger military presence in the Middle East. Because in essence, like with Syria, what the benefit was such a light footprint. And, at any given time, I think, you get 2,500 to 5,500 Russian officers or Russian officials or military on the ground. And so that was kind of beneficial for the Russians. They didn't have to deploy a huge force. Tartus is just a naval facility, so it's not a base. It's mostly for refueling. Whereas Hmeimim, their air base in Latakia, that's more of a really crucial node or kind of bottleneck for Russia's operations in Africa. So this is where Russia unloads its planes or reloads its planes, refuels, so they can provide forces to kind of their Africa Corps for other military operations in Africa. What's really interesting is throughout the Syrian civil war, the Russians established outposts throughout the country. Most of these were withdrawn. I have a feeling that, or at least from what I've seen, is there's no movement from the Golan Heights. So Russia may have military outposts with officers still in southern Syria. This is just kind of shows how enmeshed they were to an extent in the country. But they also, at the moment, I think are just focusing on keeping those two bases rather than trying to expand elsewhere. And maybe to get their troops that are in other parts of Syria back to kind of the main Alawite heartlands.
Yeah, there are a lot of videos showing columns of Russians storing out in various directions and consolidating, but it's just very hard to put all of the pieces together because it's such a dynamic environment, really.
Yeah, and I think I've also seen a lot of coverage or sort of social media activity yesterday suggesting with these videos that the Russians are quote unquote chased out of Syria, that they're fleeing. And I think we have not seen enough evidence to say that that is really true. So I think we need more to establish that Russia is actually leaving Syria. We have not seen any real indication of that.
Let's try to unpack the impact of what has happened and what continues to happen for Russia's relationship with key regional players. And I would to start with Iran, because partnership with Iran has emerged as one of the lifelines for Putin's military effort in Ukraine. And that is seen as something really crucial for Russia's presence in the Middle East, but also can be leveraged for other purposes. So, Nicole, what do you think will happen now between Tehran and Moscow? Now, Tehran itself is in a very difficult spot given what Israel has done to the network of proxies, to the exchange of missile marriages a couple of months back, and the incoming Trump administration, where a lot of people in the Trump universe saying that the priority in the Middle East will be re-squeezing hard the regime.
I mean, with Iran, what is really interesting and crucial to understand is Syria was really the place where the institutional ties between Russia and Iran were formed. And these ties and these networks between, the Defense Ministry, Iran's Quds Force, Iran's IRGC Aerospace Force, and Russian officials, that's going to endure. I mean, that is still there. There may be a blame game going on right now, but the institutional linkages, the battlefield experience that Russia and Iran gained, I mean, that's not going to go away. It's really remarkable to think about the level of military cooperation Russia and Iran had in Syria. I mean, Russia had no experience of joint military campaigns with Iran, but they formed a pretty cohesive division of labor where Iranian ground forces were on the ground coordinating with Russian generals or Russian operations or officers on the ground with airstrikes. And so there is this kind of synergy, and this relationship has grown substantially. I mean, compared to the last Trump administration, when there was rumors about Russia trying to expel Iran from Syria, to where we are today, where they're much more united as a front. And then on top of that is where Russia's much more reliant on Iran. I mean, the war in Ukraine fundamentally shifted that as well. If Syria established the ties and kind of gave those channels, the war in Ukraine transformed it and broadened it into many other areas. So the incoming Trump administration is going to face an Iran and Russia that's a lot closer. The issue is now, Iran's taking a big hit in Syria. I don't see Iran coming back or trying to, unless if there's kind of a lot of conflict or strife where Iran sees an opportunity to kind of foment unrest and regain some influence in the East. And so I think you might see that if Iran faces more pressure when it comes to maximum pressure.
What about other players, Hanna? I hear a lot an argument made in Russia that, we injected ourselves in the Middle Eastern affairs through our involvement in Syria campaign. And that's why countries in the region started to pay attention. That's, for example, how OPEC Plus cooperation with Saudi Arabia came about. And we are relevant as long as we are strong, respected, and able to protect our two-tier partners, be it al-Assad regime. Now it's gone. That affect the reputation and partnerships in these functional areas like, for example, world market with Saudi Arabia or financial transactions that banks in Dubai help the Russians to clear.
I'll come to Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states in a second, but let me just briefly say something about Israel and Turkey, because I think these are the two players vis-a-vis which Russia has truly lost some leverage now. Those are, of course, players that have skin in the game in Syria, right? And so Israel, for instance, always needed to navigate with caution vis-a-vis Russia, not just in Syria, but even on dossiers like Ukraine, because Israel saw Russia as what it called a neighbor to the north, Russia having a military presence there. The two sides had to entertain a military deconfliction channel. So Israel, when targeting Iranian proxies on the ground over the years, needed to be engaged with the Russians in order to do this. And I think because of the great weakening of Iran and Hezbollah in Syria, and then also Bashar al-Assad being gone and Russia being less of an influential factor, I think the Israelis have gained, generally speaking, some greater room to maneuver, including vis-a-vis Russia. How that plays out on other foreign policy files, I think, is yet to be seen. Vis-a-vis Turkey, there's also leverage loss, I think. This is a relationship, Russia-Turkey, in which leverage has generally shifted in favor of Ankara since the invasion of Ukraine, I think, because Russia became more dependent on Turkey economically for sanctions evasion. The two sides, of course, are not just present in Syria, but also in Libya and in the South Caucasus. And in the South Caucasus, dynamics have also shifted in favor of Azerbaijan and Turkey. I think Nicole used the term kingmaker earlier in our conversation. I think the Turks have the greatest, in terms of the external actors, the greatest bargaining power in terms of future Russian influence in Syria. So there's some leverage loss there. Coming to the other players that you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Arab states, Egypt, yes, I think there is that reputational damage to some extent. These countries loathe the fact that Putin supported Assad in 2015. I think we had a fatwa by Saudi clerics denouncing this at the time. So they very much loathe that fact. But then Russia did earn itself some respect for standing with Assad through all of these years. And the perception was that, hey, the Russians came out on top in Syria. And so that gained Russia some respect, I think, both among elites as well as what we call the Arab street. Now I think that reputation is dampened. That was at least the immediate gut reaction that I got from people in the Gulf when I was there on the weekend. But I'm not sure that that will necessarily translate into reduced cooperation on the kinds of dossiers that we're talking about, whether that's OPEC Plus with the Saudis, whether that's Russia building the El Dabaa nuclear power plant in Egypt. Those pockets of cooperation that exist between Russia and those countries, I think there's pragmatic interest from both sides to continue that. And so I don't think that there will be an immediate impact in terms of what's happened. I think the impact is sort of more diffuse when it comes to Russia's reputation in the region.
Parting thought should be about Ukraine. As I discussed that with my Ukrainian contacts, and you see that also in the social media by influential Ukrainian experts, military personnel, activists, everybody is very cheerful. Like Russia's nose has been bloodied, Russia's reputation has been tarnished. Everything what is seen as a defeat for Putin and a big public humiliation is beneficial for Ukraine. Is that so? If there were any material impact on this war, and if so, is it positive, or is it to the contrary that Russia will be able to withdraw some of its assets, for example, from Kharkiv and relocate that back to Russia and use that against Ukraine, where Russia is not short of glide bombs, but is short of experienced pilots and crews that can man this aircraft. So at the end, it can be medicated for Ukraine. What do you think, Nicole?
I mean, they think the portrayal of this as just, Putin's loss kind of detracts from the bigger, issue. And that was fundamentally that this was about the Syrian people and the kind of dictatorship that they lived under and like the immense suffering. And so I've been kind of wary of that characterization that this is just about Putin. It's also about Syria and the Syrian people who really overcame like all odds and, just terrible suffering. So, but when it comes to the connection to Ukraine, I mean, there's always been a connection to Ukraine. It kind of wound back at the full circle in some ways. The VKS, or the Russian Aerospace Force, they don't have a major contingent in them. Like it's quite like modest. I think it's one Su-24 squadron and a few helicopters. So how decisive that would be in the battlefield, I'm not sure. I mean, I think Russia is probably more relying on ground forces anyway. This is probably going to be the more decisive factor rather than the VKS. So I would be skeptical about saying that this is going to have a direct battlefield impact. But what it does show is that Russia's like expeditionary like interventions or models of going into countries in Syria it shows that it's not sustainable, especially when you're supporting a dictatorship who is corrupt with an army who didn't really perform very well and just collapsed. I mean, and there were lessons even Russia, I think, took when they went into Ukraine from Syria. I think Russia assumed that, went into Ukraine, they would be welcomed and can actually integrate parts of the Ukrainian population, or at least a force for their military, in the way that they did for southern Syria, where they integrated parts of the southern Syrian opposition groups into the military. So there seemed to be some assumption, or at least some connection there. And that's kind of been there at the outset. But I think the fundamental lesson that the Russians will be taking from Syria will be kind of how distractions may not be very helpful for some of their immediate and more important objectives.
I have not much to add to what Nicole says. I very much agree with it. I think it would be dangerous to infer from what we just saw unfold in Syria that we should therefore expect to see a Russian weakness in Ukraine, I think that would be very dangerous to think that. But I'd like to make sort of one broader point or reflection here at the end, which is that in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, it's become very popular to think of Russia as part of an axis of upheaval, as an actor that likes to foment upheaval and instability globally because it's beneficial to Russia's prosecution of this war. And I think that the environment in the Middle East post-October 7th of last year proves that Russia has a limited tolerance for upheaval. Initially, we thought that this environment benefits Russia because it will divert a certain amount of US or Western attention and military resources away from Ukraine to the Middle East. And that's been true to some extent. But the chain of events set in motion with Israel's concerted campaign against Iran and its proxies has led us to a point today where Assad is gone, Iran is at its weakest in decades, and Iran is a partner to Russia. And so I think the strategic outlook for Russia is now less fortuitous than it was a year ago. And the simultaneity of conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East is also going to constrain, at least over the short term, what Russia and Iran can do for each other. I very much agree with Nicole about the general trajectory of the Russia-Iran relationship and cooperation, but I think there are constraints now in the moment. And so too much upheaval, not good for Russia when it, is for a constrained Russia that is prioritizing the war in Ukraine.
Russia's problem is obviously that it cannot be in control of the rapid developments around the world. As the Syrian advance of HDS and other rebels has surprised us, it has surprised people in the Kremlin. And I think that next year will be full of surprises still for both Syria and the region and Russia with the arrival of disruptor in charge, US President Donald Trump. Thank you so much, Hanna and Nicole. We definitely will continue to watch this volatile region. Thanks for being with me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. This was great.